Major Grigory Volkov held his 295 at 32,000 feet and watched the Bering Strait slide beneath him like a gray scar. He had flown this route 6 times. He knew the gap, not a gap in coverage. NORAD's radar fence stretched from Alaska to Greenland without a clean break. The gap lived in timing. Soviet signals intelligence had mapped the handoff window between 2 North American radar stations along the Aleutian chain, a 90-second interval where track data transferred from one facility to the next. During that window, a contact could drift off scope. Nobody lost the aircraft permanently, but the lag created ambiguity, and ambiguity meant a slower scramble response from Elmendorf. Volkov's mission briefing in Anadyr had used that window as the centerpiece of the flight plan. Penetrate to within 200 nautical miles of the Alaskan coast during the handoff, loiter long enough to trigger American search radar into full acquisition mode, then turn for home. The point of the exercise: measure American reaction time. This kind of story never trends on its own. Too specific, too buried in Cold War paperwork for anyone to stumble across it. A like and a subscribe go a long way. Drop a comment about what drew you in, and that's what keeps these deep cuts coming. Volkov's navigator, Captain Leonid Surenko, had plotted the ingress to hit the handoff window at 0742 local time on the morning of March 14, 1973. Surenko trusted the math. The signals intelligence packet from Fleet Headquarters carried a confidence rating of high, which in Soviet naval aviation meant someone important had signed off on it. The crew of 7 settled into the monotonous drone of 4 Kuznetsov NK-12 turboprops, the loudest engines ever fitted to a production aircraft, audible on American sonar hydrophones from hundreds of miles away when the Bear flew low over water. At altitude, that noise folded into the airframe and became a kind of white vibration that loosened fillings. The after-action report filed by Volkov's regiment after the mission, declassified by the Russian Ministry of Defense in 2004, described the flight plan as fully consistent with assessed American detection capabilities. Their word, not mine. Fully consistent, meaning they expected to be found eventually on Moscow's schedule. What Volkov did not know, could not have known, involved 2 Alaska Air National Guard pilots sitting in an alert shack at King Salmon Airport, 160 miles southwest of where NORAD expected to vector its Intercept. These 2 had not been tasked. Their F-4 Sea Phantoms carried a standard combat air patrol loadout, but held no active mission assignment that morning. They belonged to the 176th Tactical Fighter Squadron, a guard unit that regular Air Force officers in Anchorage regarded as a half-step above a flying club. The pair had been playing cribbage since 5 a.m. Volkov's Bear crossed the international date line at 0738, 4 minutes ahead of the planned handoff window. Surenko noted the time in his navigation log. Everything tracked. The Bear's Rubin search radar stayed passive, no emissions to betray their exact position before the timing window opened. Volkov ran a disciplined cockpit. He had earned a commendation for the 5th flight along this corridor, and he expected this 6th run to produce another measured professional probe of American air defenses. 12 minutes later, 2 guard pilots he'd never heard of would be climbing through 19,000 feet on an intercept vector they'd calculated themselves, off the books, before Elmendorf's phone even rang. So why did nobody scramble, buddy? The NORAD operations log for March 14, 1973, housed at the Cheyenne Mountain Declassified Records Annex and partially released in 1997, contains an entry at 0714 Zulu time. That translates to 2:14 a.m. at NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs, 0714 local in Alaska. The entry reads, Contact Alpha, 77, bearing 295, range 420, no scramble authorized. 11 words, no explanation attached. The next log entry appears 9 minutes later and concerns an unrelated track off the coast of Newfoundland. 9 minutes of silence on the Alaska sector during an inbound Bear contact. The Alaskan NORAD region operated under what the Air Force called the Centaur Protocol in early 1973, a tiered alert system that required regional commander authorization before fighters launched against unidentified tracks outside a 50-mile coastal buffer. The protocol existed for a bureaucratically sound reason. False alarms had plagued the Aleutian radar stations throughout 1972, with fishing vessels, weather balloons, and atmospheric ducting, producing ghost contacts at a rate that embarrassed Elmendorf's operations staff. According to a General Accounting Office review completed in August of that year, the Alaskan region had scrambled fighters against 41 false contacts in a 6-month period. 41. Each scramble cost between $8,000 and $14,000 in fuel and maintenance, and everyone generated paperwork that climbed to the deputy commander's desk. Centaur solved the cost problem by adding a human gate. A duty officer at the Regional Operations Center had to confirm the track and assess threat probability, then request scramble authority from the senior officer on watch. That senior officer on the morning of March 14th held the rank of lieutenant colonel and had arrived at his station 11 minutes earlier, at 0703 local. The file does not give his name. Someone redacted it from the 1997 release, which feels deliberate given that every other officer in the log appears by full name and rank. This anonymous lieutenant colonel received the contact report on Alpha 77 and logged no scramble authorized. The center protocol gave him that discretion. Track confidence sat below the threshold. The contact had appeared during the handoff window between stations, exactly as Soviet intelligence had predicted, and the receiving station's initial classification flagged it as probable atmospheric return. A ghost. The lieutenant colonel treated it like a ghost. Meanwhile, 160 miles southwest, Captain Dale Erickson and First Lieutenant James Taggart of the 176th Tactical Fighter Squadron operated under no such protocol. Guard units at King Salmon maintained their own informal listening watch on a shared UHF frequency with the nearest radar facility at Cold Bay. Cold Bay's operators talked to each other the way radar operators everywhere talk to each other, openly, casually, without encryption on internal nets. Erickson heard the initial detection call on Alpha 77 come across that frequency at 0716 local. He set down his cribbage hand. Taggart reached for his flight helmet before Erickson said a word. They had drilled this between themselves for months, an unauthorized contingency, never briefed up, never approved. The Cold Bay operators did not know anyone outside NORAD's formal command net could hear them. That gap in communication security sits nowhere in the official record. The records don't say whether it persisted after March 14th, or whether anyone even discovered it. Erickson grabbed his nav kneeboard off a hook by the door and stepped into air cold enough to crack skin. King Salmon's alert shack sat 40 yards from the flight line, a single-story cinder block rectangle with 2 cots, a coffee maker that had burned its last good pot sometime in 1971, and a klaxon mounted above the door that connected directly to Elmendorf's scramble circuit. That klaxon had not sounded in 11 weeks. The wiring worked. Maintenance checked it every Tuesday. The silence came from Centaur, from the protocol that required a lieutenant colonel nobody can name to pick up a phone and authorize what 2 guard pilots had just authorized for themselves. The shack smelled like kerosene and mildew. Under that sat the particular staleness that accumulates when the same 2 men sleep in shifts in an unventilated room through an Alaskan winter. Taggart had taped a Farrah Fawcett poster to the wall above his cot in January. By March, it had curled at the corners from condensation. The coffee maker's heating element gave off a faint electrical burn smell, even when empty, and Erickson had stopped unplugging it because the outlet sparked. These details come from Taggart's own account, written for the Air National Guard Association newsletter in 1978. 5 years after the Intercept, when enough time had passed that the 176th commander apparently stopped caring who talked. The base itself functioned as a bureaucratic checkpoint designed to say no. King Salmon existed primarily as a forward operating location for fisheries patrol and seasonal training rotations. Its runway could handle fighters. Its fuel depot stayed stocked. But its communications infrastructure tied into Elmendorf through a single secure landline that routed scramble orders from the Alaskan NORAD Region Operations Center. No order on that line, no authorized launch. The klaxon stayed silent, and the klaxon represented the entire chain of command condensed into a single electrical impulse that never arrived. Ericsson ignored it. He and Taggart had spent the previous 4 months constructing what amounted to a parallel alert system. They monitored Cold Bay's unencrypted internal frequency on a handheld UHF receiver Taggart had purchased at an electronics surplus store in Anchorage for $12. They kept a plotting board in the shack with range rings centered on king salmon. They had calculated intercept geometries for inbound tracks from the west at various speeds and altitudes, assuming a 295 flight profile. Because the Bear flew the same corridors with the same predictability that made Soviet naval aviation both professional and exploitable. Ericsson had timed their ground procedures: helmets, G-suits, walk to aircraft, strap in, engine start, taxi, takeoff. 14 minutes from the moment they heard a contact call to wheels off the runway. They had shaved it to 11 by pre-positioning their gear and keeping the Phantom's inertial navigation platform in standby alignment, which consumed power the base operations officer never questioned because he assumed it related to a training requirement. One detail from Taggart's account has nothing to do with the intercept but refuses to leave my notes alone. He mentions that the alert shack's single window faced east, away from the flight line, and that every morning the sunrise hit the glass at an angle that projected a rectangle of orange light onto the opposite wall directly over Ericsson's cot. Ericsson slept through it every time. Taggart found this remarkable enough to mention in a 5-page article about intercepting a Soviet bomber. Make of that what you will. At 0716, the Cold Bay frequency carried the track call. Ericsson copied the bearing and range. Taggart ran the intercept math on their plotting board, while Ericsson called King Salmon's base operations desk, not for permission, but to notify them that 2 F-4Cs would be departing runway 12 in approximately 8 minutes. The operations desk log for that morning records the call with a notation that reads, "Pilots state training sortie. No further action required. Training sortie." Taggart pulled his harness straps tight in the rear cockpit of the lead Phantom at 0722. The J-79 engines wound up with the high, thin scream that anyone who has stood near an F-4 remembers in their teeth. King Salmon's runway stretched out under flat gray light, frost still visible on the taxiway edges. Ericsson released brakes at 0724. Taggart's aircraft, flown by a third pilot whose name the records simply do not provide, followed 30 seconds later, 11 minutes from contact call to wheels up, 3 minutes faster than their own benchmark. The klaxon above the alert shack door never made a sound. The F-106 Delta Dart carried a nuclear weapon in its belly. Not every airframe, not every mission, but the MB-1 Genie unguided rocket, tipped with a 1.5 kiloton W-25 warhead, sat in the weapons bay of NORAD alert interceptors as standard loadout through most of the 1960s and into the 70s. The weapon's purpose bordered on the absurd. Fire it into a formation of incoming Soviet bombers and let the nuclear detonation swat them from the sky. Precise aim was irrelevant, and so was radar lock. Just get close enough and pull the trigger, and a small sun would bloom at 40,000 feet. The Air Force had test-fired one over Yucca Flat in 1957 with 5 officers standing directly beneath the detonation point, which tells you everything about how the era calculated acceptable risk. This context matters for understanding why Centaur existed, why the anonymous lieutenant colonel logged no scramble authorized, and why Ericsson's unauthorized departure from King Salmon carried consequences far beyond a paperwork violation. NORAD's alert interceptor fleet in 1973 included F-106s at Elmendorf loaded with live genies. The scramble authorization chain did not exist to save jet fuel. It existed because launching a nuclear-armed fighter against an unconfirmed contact meant putting a weapon with a blast radius of 1,000 feet into the hands of a single pilot operating under stress, fatigue, and the fog of incomplete radar data. The Hughes MA-1 fire control system aboard the F-106 could execute an entire intercept autonomously, from radar acquisition to weapons release, through a mode the pilots called the aluminum overcast. The pilot selected the target. The computer flew the approach, calculated the release point, and fired the genie. Human judgment entered the loop at exactly one moment. Target selection. Pick the wrong blip, and a fishing trawler or a commercial airliner ceased to exist in a flash of fission products. The Centaur protocol's real job amounted to keeping that sequence from initiating on bad data. Every false scramble carried the theoretical possibility of a nuclear detonation over the North Pacific. 41 false scrambles in 6 months had concentrated mines at Cheyenne Mountain. Erickson and Taggart flew F-4Cs. No genies, no nuclear capability. Their Phantoms carried 4 AIM-7 Sparrow radar-guided missiles and a centerline gun pod. Conventional ordnance, incapable of ending civilization. That distinction should have mattered to the disciplinary process that followed. According to the administrative record from the 176th Parent Wing at Kulis Air National Guard Base, it did not. The investigation treated the unauthorized launch as a violation of Centaur, regardless of weapons loadout, because the protocol drew no distinction between nuclear-armed and conventional interceptors. A scramble required authorization. Authorization required the chain of command. Erickson had bypassed both by calling his departure a training sortie, a classification that required only base operations notification and freed him from NORAD's scramble circuit entirely. The maneuver showed either profound recklessness or a precise understanding of which regulations applied to guard units operating from forward locations under peacetime rules. Taggart's 1978 account suggests the latter. He describes Erickson spending evenings in the alert shack reading the Air National Guard's Operational Procedures Manual, a document Taggart calls the driest thing ever printed on government paper. Erickson had found the seam. Guard units on non-alert status at forward operating locations fell under Base Operations Authority for training flights. Centaur governed alert scrambles. A training sortie that happened to fly toward a Soviet bomber occupied a gray zone that no regulation explicitly addressed because nobody at Air Force headquarters had imagined anyone would try it. The career risk remained enormous. An unauthorized intercept of a foreign military aircraft, even without weapons engagement, generated diplomatic exposure. If Erickson's Phantom spooked Volkov into a course change that Moscow interpreted as an aggressive act, the escalation path ran straight to the White House. Erickson held the rank of captain in a guard unit that flew weekend training sorties and supported fisheries patrol. He lacked the authority to create an international incident. He created one anyway. Climbing through 26,000 feet over the Bering Sea at 0736, 6 minutes before Volkov's Bear reached the handoff window that Soviet intelligence had so carefully mapped. The Bering Sea at 0736 in March looks like the inside of a steel drum. No horizon line. No color differentiation between water and sky. Gray merging into gray, with a cloud deck sitting at 28,000 feet that turned Ericsson's world into a featureless tunnel of frozen vapor. Below that deck, the sea surface ran with whitecaps driven by 40-knot winds out of the northwest. Above it, nothing but cold air and the faint wash of stars that Alaska offers, even in pre-dawn twilight at that latitude. Ericsson's Phantom punched through the cloud layer at 0738 and emerged into a sky so clear and empty that the APQ-100 radar in the nose became the only proof anything else occupied it. Taggart called the contact at 52 nautical miles. Bearing 287, closing speed just under 900 knots combined. The blip held steady at 32,000 feet. Exactly the altitude Cold Bay had reported. Exactly the altitude a 295 maintained on a standard reconnaissance track. Volkov flew with the discipline of a man who trusted his intelligence briefing. The radar gap between stations would shield him for another 4 minutes. American fighters required Centaur authorization, and Centaur required track confirmation. And track confirmation required the receiving station to hold the contact for a minimum of 3 sweeps before upgrading its classification from atmospheric return to probable aircraft. By Volkov's math, he owned those 4 minutes. Erickson closed the distance at 0.92 Mach. The second Phantom held a combat spread position roughly a mile to the right and 2,000 feet above the lead aircraft. Standard intercept geometry for a 2-ship element approaching a non-maneuvering target. 1 fighter commits to identification, while the wingman maintains altitude advantage and weapons coverage. Ericsson had briefed this profile during their months of unofficial preparation. The execution matched the brief, which says something about two guard pilots flying an Intercept they had rehearsed only on a plotting board in a cinder block shack. At 30 miles, Taggart refined the radar lock and confirmed a single large return consistent with a heavy bomber. No escort. No electronic countermeasures jamming his scope. Volkov flew alone and electronically silent, relying entirely on the gap he believed protected him. The Tu-95's Burkett radar, a capable search system that could detect fighter-sized targets at ranges exceeding 60 miles, apparently sat in standby mode. Soviet doctrine on these reconnaissance runs called for passive flight profiles to avoid triggering American electronic intelligence collectors along the Aleutian chain. Volkov followed doctrine. Doctrine told him he flew unseen. At 12 miles, Ericsson dropped below Volkov's altitude, descending to 30,000 feet for a belly approach that would keep the Phantom out of the Tu-95's limited downward visibility until the final conversion. The turbulence hit at 29,500 feet, a band of clear air chop that slammed the F-4 hard enough to bang Taggart's helmet against the canopy rail. The Phantom shuddered, steadied, and Ericsson held course. The J-79s behind them produced a low, sustained roar that filled the cockpit like white noise, punctuated by the sharper rattle of airframe vibration through the chop. At 4 miles, Ericsson pulled the Phantom's nose up and began the conversion turn that would place him on Volkov's left wing. The maneuver took 90 seconds. During those 90 seconds, Volkov's tail gunner, stationed in the rear of the Tu-95's fuselage with a paired AM-23 cannon installation and a small targeting radar, should have detected the approaching fighter. The tail warning radar on a Bear possessed a detection range of roughly 8 miles against a fighter-sized target in clear air. Ericsson had closed from 12 miles to 4 without triggering it, which means either the system sat powered down alongside the Burkett, or the cloud layer and approach geometry masked the Phantom's return. Sources conflict on which explanation applies. The Soviet after-action report from this flight, referenced in a Defense Intelligence Agency summary, circulated in 1974, uses language that translates roughly as complete surprise achieved by the intercepting aircraft. Their phrasing carries a tone closer to institutional embarrassment than technical analysis. Ericsson rolled wings level 300 feet off Volkov's left wingtip at 0744. Colonel Dean Whitfield stood at the Alaskan NORAD region operations console at Elmendorf with a styrofoam cup in one hand and a shift change briefing folder in the other, reading a summary of overnight radar contacts that did not include the one currently sitting 300 feet from a Soviet bomber. The graveyard crew had logged off at 0700. The day crew had logged on at 0715. Between those two moments, the operations center operated in what internal documents call reduced manning posture, a phrase that meant the senior controller had walked to the latrine, and the junior controller had walked to the coffee machine, and the radar scope sat monitored by a staff sergeant named Palicki, who held no authority to initiate a scramble recommendation. Palicki watched the same data feed that Cold Bay generated. He saw the contact appear, tracked it for 2 sweeps, and picked up the phone to notify the senior controller. The senior controller, according to the duty log, returned to the console at 0721, 5 minutes after Ericsson and Taggart had already started engines at King Salmon. The senior controller reviewed the contact, classified it as a probable Soviet reconnaissance track based on altitude, heading, and speed, and initiated the Centaur notification sequence by calling Whitfield's office. Whitfield arrived on the operations floor at 0729. By then, Ericsson had passed through 22,000 feet, and Taggart held radar contact on Volkov at 41 nautical miles. Whitfield's first action upon reaching the console involved asking whether the overnight crew had left any notes about prior activity on that bearing. They had not. His second action involved requesting confirmation from Cold Bay that the contact remained on scope. Cold Bay confirmed. His third action involved reaching for the scramble authorization phone that connected to the alert barn at Elmendorf, where 2 F-106s sat loaded with live genies and crewed by pilots who needed his voice on that line before they could move. Whitfield picked up the phone at 0732. The alert pilots at Elmendorf acknowledged the scramble order at 0733. Engine start occurred at 0736, the precise moment Ericsson's Phantom crossed 26,000 feet, already 40 miles closer to Volkov than anyone in the command net realized. The F-106s at Elmendorf needed 14 minutes from engine start to intercept altitude at combat power. Volkov's position at 0736 placed him roughly 110 nautical miles from the Elmendorf alert birds. Even at the Delta Dart's sprint speed of Mach 1.9, the geometry did not close. Volkov's track ran perpendicular to the intercept vector from Elmendorf, which meant the F-106s faced a tail chase rather than a head-on merge. Tail chases against a target moving at 400 knots eat fuel and time in roughly equal proportion. The Elmendorf interceptors carried enough JAP-4 for approximately 40 minutes of afterburner flight. The math produced an intercept window that opened 60 miles past the point where Ericsson had already parked himself on Volkov's wing. Centaur functioned exactly as designed. Steps followed procedure, notifications reached the correct desks, authorizations flowed through the correct channels. The system processed Volkov's incursion with the methodical precision of an organization built to prevent unauthorized nuclear weapons employment, and it delivered its response 17 minutes after 2. Guard pilots in conventional Phantoms had already solved the problem with a $12 radio and a plotting board. I have never seen a more beautiful photograph come out of a worse decision. That line belongs to Captain Raymond Okada, the photo intelligence officer at Elmendorf who processed Ericsson's gun camera film on the afternoon of March 14th. Okada's assessment, recorded in a memo to the Alaskan Air Command Intelligence Section dated March 15, 1973, captures the precise moment NORAD discovered that two of its least important pilots had accomplished what its entire alert architecture had failed to deliver. The film arrived at Elmendorf's photo lab inside a standard canister, hand-carried by a supply sergeant on the afternoon C-130 shuttle from King Salman. Ericsson had labeled it with his name, tail number, and the date. He filed no mission report and submitted no intercept summary. He dropped the canister into the outbound mail bin at King Salmon Base Operations with the same paperwork he would have attached to a training sortie, because, officially, that remained what the flight had been. The canister sat in a canvas mailbag alongside requisition forms and personnel paperwork for 3 hours before the C-130 departed. Nobody at King Salmon flagged it. Only Ericsson, Taggart, and the crew chief, who had watched two Phantoms launch toward the Bering Sea and return 47 minutes later without explanation, knew what it contained. Okada developed the film at 14:30 local time. The gun camera on an F-4C mounted in the nose, slightly offset to the left of the centerline, and captured 16mm black and white footage whenever the pilot activated the weapon system, or in Ericsson's case, whenever he toggled the camera manually using the override switch on the left console. Ericsson had run the camera for approximately 90 seconds during his formation join on Volkov's left wing. The resulting footage contained 72 feet of exposed film, showing a 295 Bear D in crystalline detail from 300 feet. The Soviet aircraft filled the frame. Contra-rotating propellers on the inboard Kuznetsov NK-12 turboprops blurred into overlapping discs. The red star on the vertical stabilizer stood sharp against the natural aluminum finish. And beneath the star, stenciled in Cyrillic characters roughly 18 inches tall, sat the aircraft's Bort number, its individual airframe identifier. Okada recognized what he held. He called the intelligence section. The intelligence section called Whitfield. Whitfield, who had spent the previous 6 hours managing the aftermath of a scramble that launched too late to intercept anything, now learned that an intercept had occurred anyway. Conducted by pilots he did not control, flying aircraft he had not authorized, on a mission that existed nowhere in the center log. The Bort number changed everything. American intelligence had tracked Soviet long-range aviation units by tail number for years. cross-referencing visual identifications made during intercepts with signals intelligence, satellite photography of Soviet airfields, and defector debriefings. Each confirmed BORT number connected to a specific regiment and base, a specific commander with a specific operational history. Ericsson's footage gave Elmendorf's intelligence section a clean read on an airframe they could trace back to its home station at Ukrainka, in the Soviet Far East, the primary staging base for bear reconnaissance missions along the Alaskan coast. The DIA summary from 1974 notes that this particular BORT number had not appeared in any previous American intercept photography, meaning Ericsson had captured an airframe that NORAD's official alert system had never managed to photograph despite years of trying. Whitfield faced a problem with no comfortable solution. The film represented real intelligence value. Elmendorf's analysts wanted it distributed through standard channels to Pacific Air Forces and DIA. Distribution required sourcing. Sourcing required explaining how a guard captain flying an unauthorized training sortie had positioned himself 300 feet from a Soviet bomber, while NORAD's nuclear-armed interceptors idled on a runway 110 miles behind the action. The explanation would embarrass the command. Suppressing the film would waste the intelligence. Whitfield chose the intelligence. The photo report went out on March 16th with full sourcing, Ericsson's name attached, and a cover memorandum that Okada later described as the most carefully worded document he ever helped draft. That memo, partially declassified in 2003, runs 4 pages. The first 3 pages detail the intelligence value of the photography. The 4th page addresses the circumstances of acquisition in language so dense with passive constructions and bureaucratic hedging that the unauthorized nature of the intercept nearly disappears beneath the syntax. Someone at Elmendorf understood that the film told 2 stories simultaneously, one about Soviet vulnerability and one about American dysfunction, and decided which story to tell loudly and which to whisper. So, what happens when an intercept report arrives without a scramble order to match it? Brigadier General Louis Harmon, commander of the 21st Composite Wing at Elmendorf, discovered the answer on March 17th when 2 documents landed on his desk simultaneously. The first carried a DIA distribution number and contained Okada's photo analysis, 4 pages of intelligence product built around 72 feet of gun camera film, showing a previously unidentified 295 Bear D at close range. The second carried Whitfield's cover memorandum, the one written in prose so carefully neutralized it read like an insurance claim. Harmon, according to his executive officer's account recorded in a 1989 oral history for the Air Force Historical Research Agency, read the intelligence product first and called it outstanding work. Then he read the cover memo. Then he read it again. Then he set both documents on his desk and sat without speaking for what his executive officer estimated at 2 full minutes. The office held nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the muffled clatter of a typewriter from the adjoining room. Harmon finally looked up and said something his executive officer paraphrased as follows: "Either we scrambled aircraft I don't know about, or someone flew an intercept I didn't authorize, and I need to know which problem I have before close of business today." He had both problems, and neither. The center log for March 14th showed a valid scramble order issued to Elmendorf's F-106 alert detachment at 0732. The alert aircraft launched, climbed to intercept altitude, failed to achieve contact with the target before it departed the identification zone, and returned to base. Standard outcome for a late launching intercept against a target on a perpendicular track. The log contained no mention of king salmon, no mention of F-4s, no mention of Ericsson or Taggart. The intercept report attached to the intelligence product referenced a visual identification and photography pass conducted by aircraft from the 176th Tactical Fighter Group, a guard unit assigned to King Salmon for routine training deployment. The 176th held no NORAD alert commitment. Its aircraft carried no intercept tasking. Its pilots operated under peacetime training rules that explicitly prohibited independent engagement with unidentified contacts. Every line of Ericsson's Intercept report described an event that could not have occurred under the authorities governing his unit, his aircraft, and his mission. Harmon convened a meeting on March 18th that included Whitfield, the Alaskan Air Command Judge Advocate, and the 176th Detachment Commander at King Salmon, a lieutenant colonel named Bryce Weber who had not known about Ericsson's flight until Whitfield's office called him on the 16th. Weber confirmed that Ericsson had filed the sortie as a training mission, that no scramble order had reached King Salmon through any channel, and that the intercept represented Ericsson's independent decision based on information obtained from a radar operator at Cold Bay whose name Weber declined to provide on the phone. The judge advocate outlined 3 possible administrative actions ranging from a letter of reprimand to a flying evaluation board that could pull Ericsson's wings. Harmon's decision was uncomfortable for exactly this reason. Punishing Ericsson meant acknowledging that NORAD's own system had failed to intercept a Soviet bomber during a gap created by a known vulnerability in the radar network. A vulnerability Ericsson had identified months earlier through channels that produced no institutional response. Rewarding Ericsson meant endorsing freelance intercepts by guard pilots operating outside the command structure built to prevent exactly the kind of uncoordinated armed response that could escalate into something catastrophic. The intelligence product made suppression impossible. DIA already had the photographs. Pacific Air Forces already had the Bort number. The information had entered a distribution pipeline that Harmon lacked the authority to recall. Harmon chose a third path. The administrative file on the March 14th intercept, referenced in the partially declassified records released in 2003, contains no disciplinary action against Ericsson and no commendation. It contains instead a recommendation, routed through Alaskan Air Command to Pacific Air Forces, that King Salmon receive a formal NORAD alert tasking with dedicated intercept aircraft and 24-hour radar connectivity to Elmendorf's operations center. The recommendation carried Harmon's signature and bore the date March 22, 1973. 8 days after Ericsson proved the gap existed by flying through it, we observed 2 American fighters of the Phantom type materialize from below cloud cover at a range of approximately 400 meters with no prior warning from any electronic surveillance system aboard this aircraft. That sentence appears in a translated excerpt from Volkov's post-mission debrief held at Ukrainka and referenced in a DIA Signals Intelligence Summary from late 1973. The summary's classification dropped to secret in 1998. Portions remain redacted. Volkov's radio operator, a senior lieutenant identified in the DIA document only by the surname Chesnikov, detected the F-4's radar emissions 6 seconds before the visual sighting. 6 seconds. At closing speeds north of 500 knots, 6 seconds bought Chesnikov enough time to key his intercom and say one word, "Fighters," before the first Phantom slid into position off the left wing and the second settled beneath the fuselage, where no defensive gun could track it. The Bear D carried a tail gunner station equipped with twin 23mm cannons. The gunner, seated in a pressurized blister at the extreme rear of the fuselage, reported hearing Chesnikov's call and traversing his turret left before realizing the American aircraft sat inside his minimum depression angle. The guns pointed at empty sky above a target tucked 30 degrees below their reach. Volkov held course. That detail matters more than anything else in the debrief. Soviet doctrine for reconnaissance crews encountering interceptors in international airspace required maintaining heading, altitude, and speed unless directly threatened with hostile fire. Volkov followed doctrine of. His crew held discipline, no deviation, no chaff dump, no evasive maneuvering. Professional behavior from a professional crew flying a mission they had rehearsed and executed multiple times along this corridor. But the confidence broke. The debrief transcript, or at least the portions DIA captured and translated, records Volkov's assessment that the American intercept originated from a location inconsistent with known NORAD alert bases. The response time fell outside every parameter Soviet intelligence had established for the Alaskan air defense network. Volkov stated that the intercept suggested either a previously unidentified alert facility or a standing combat air patrol operating in the radar gap his mission planning had relied upon. Soviet long-range aviation apparently took the second possibility seriously enough to suspend Bare-D reconnaissance flights along the Alaskan corridor for 11 weeks following Volkov's return. The DIA summary notes the suspension without explaining how American intelligence confirmed it. That sourcing stays classified. 11 weeks. 2 guard pilots in borrowed Phantoms, operating on information from a radar operator whose name a lieutenant colonel refused to say out loud on an unsecured phone line, shut down Soviet reconnaissance operations across the entire Alaskan approach for nearly 3 months. Volkov flew the corridor 6 times and came home confident. After the 7th, his own command grounded the route. Harmon's recommendation sat on a desk at Pacific Air Force's headquarters in Honolulu for 9 days before anyone acted on it. During those 9 days, a separate document traveled a different pipeline, a personnel action initiated by the Alaskan Air Command Judge Advocate's Office that placed a letter of counseling in Ericsson's file. Not a reprimand. A counseling letter, the administrative equivalent of a stern conversation preserved on paper. The letter cited failure to obtain proper authorization before deviating from an approved training mission profile. It referenced no Soviet aircraft, no intercept, no gun camera film. Read cold, it described a pilot who wandered off his training route and needed reminding about procedure. The file stays partially classified, but the portions released in 2003 contain enough to confirm that the letter arrived at King Salmon by courier on March 29, 1973, and that Ericsson signed the acknowledgement without comment. Taggart received an identical letter on the same day. 4 months later, July 19, 1973, both men received air medals. The citation language referenced exceptional airmanship during a reconnaissance intercept mission in the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone. The citation mentioned neither the unauthorized action nor the counseling letters sitting in their files. The medals arrived through guard channels rather than active duty channels, processed at the Adjutant General's office in Juneau rather than at Elmendorf. Someone threaded the paperwork through the one administrative pathway that kept Harmon's name off the award approval and routed the recognition through a chain of command that had never been told to punish anyone. The Cold War produced this particular species of contradiction so routinely it could fill its own taxonomy. Strategic Air Command grounded Curtis LeMay's reconnaissance pilots twice in the 1950s for penetrating Soviet airspace without authorization, then promoted them. The Navy stripped a submarine commander of his boat in 1962 for surfacing inside a Soviet exercise area, then gave him a surface warfare command 18 months later. Initiative won wars, but also started them. The American military spent 4 decades trying to build a system that rewarded the first instinct without enabling the second, and the architecture never fully resolved the tension. Every officer who served in a nuclear-capable command understood the paradox. The weapon demanded absolute obedience to launch authority, but the battlefield demanded judgment faster than any authority structure could deliver. Ericsson's Intercept fell into the gap between those two imperatives, and the institution handled it the only way it knew how, by punishing and rewarding simultaneously, hoping the net effect communicated something coherent to the next captain who picked up a phone and heard about a Soviet bomber nobody else could reach. Lieutenant General James McCarthy, who commanded Alaskan Air Command from 1975 to 1977 and reviewed the March 14th incident file during his transition briefings, offered an assessment in a 1991 interview with the Air Force Oral History Program. The interviewer asked whether Ericsson should have launched. McCarthy's answer, paraphrased in the transcript because the recording failed partway through. The tape simply stops, and the transcriber notes the gap without explanation, ran approximately as follows. If Ericsson had missed and the Soviets had mapped our radar gap without challenge, we would have spent 2 years and $40 million fixing a vulnerability that one captain fixed in 47 minutes with 2 Phantoms and a camera switch. The system punished him because the system had to. The system also made sure he got his medal because the system understood what he did. By August of 1973, King Salmon held two F-106s on 24-hour NORAD alert with dedicated radar connectivity to Elmendorf. The radar gap Ericsson had identified in his memo, the one that produced no institutional response, closed permanently. Volkov's corridor ceased to exist as a viable approach route for Soviet reconnaissance. Soviet long-range aviation resumed Alaskan flights in late June of 1973, but the new tracks shifted 200 nautical miles south, crossing portions of the identification zone covered by radar stations on Shemya and Adak. Longer routes, heavier fuel loads, reduced time on station. The cost of discovering that the gap they trusted had teeth in it, after all. The Soviet Union lost the Cold War because it built a military that could not tolerate a Captain Ericsson. Volkov did everything right, held course, maintained discipline, followed doctrine to the letter. His reward for professionalism amounted to having his entire corridor shut down by his own command because two unauthorized American fighters appeared where Soviet intelligence promised none could exist. The system that produced Volkov could not have produced Ericsson. That asymmetry mattered more than any missile count. Soviet long-range aviation operated on a planning model that assumed American air defense behaved like Soviet air defense, centralized, rigid, predictable. Every sortie brief Volkov received before March 14th of 1973 contained a threat assessment built on the premise that American interceptors launched only when American command authorities ordered them to launch. The premise held true for 11 years of Alaskan reconnaissance flights. It failed on the 12th because one guard captain in a borrowed F-4 decided the premise applied to everyone except him. A Soviet pilot who launched without authorization from his regimental commander faced court-martial. Not a counseling letter, not an administrative slap dressed up in passive voice, but court-martial with potential sentences ranging from reduction in rank to imprisonment at a disciplinary battalion. The Soviet system enforced obedience so thoroughly that initiative atrophied into a theoretical concept discussed at war colleges and practiced nowhere. When Volkov's debrief reached long-range aviation headquarters at Irkutsk, the response followed institutional logic perfectly. Suspend operations, reassess threat parameters, wait for intelligence to explain the anomaly. The explanation never came because the anomaly had no institutional origin. 2 pilots, a phone call from a radar operator, and 47 minutes of fuel. Soviet intelligence looked for a policy change and found none because no policy changed. A captain simply decided. Ericsson left the Alaska Air National Guard in 1978 with the rank of major. He flew commercial routes for Wien Air Alaska until the carrier folded in 1984, then transitioned to prior service hiring at Northwest Orient. According to a 2001 alumni newsletter from the 176th Fighter Group Association, he retired from Delta, which absorbed Northwest, in 1999 and settled in Wasilla, Alaska. He still lived there as of 2003, the last date any public record confirms. A friend asked him at a reunion dinner in Anchorage whether he regretted the Intercept. His answer, relayed secondhand through the association newsletter, they gave me a medal and a letter that says, I did a bad thing both for the same flight. I figure that means I broke exactly even.